the DCRI Fellowship Program. It's my absolute pleasure to present and have Jessica Mega from Verily come join us today. She is the CMO, Chief Medical Officer of Verily, formerly Google Life Sciences. Prior to that, she was a cardiologist at Harvard, at the Brigham, where she was a senior investigator with the TIMI Group and led several multinational studies, particularly in the field of thrombosis, and as well as trying to understand the genetic underpinnings of response to antiplatelet therapy. She's very accomplished. We're very excited to have her here, and I look forward to hearing her talk.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and I will say it's already been a tremendously pleasurable trip. We went out last night with the fellows, and I just heard some of the fellows saying soy mech, and I thought maybe I was like in the crew. That was like our code word. But I guess that's just what we need for CME credit. But really, thank you very much for inviting me here. It truly is a pleasure. And the other thing, it's nice to be in an audience where you see so many familiar faces, and really it's really quite fun to be home in a way. I grew up in North Carolina, as we were talking about last night, and it's Meredith, I don't know if she's here or not, can testify that it was really fun. We got to kind of relive our high school experience, and it's nice to be back, both the awkward moments and the good moments. So today what I want to do is talk a little bit about where technology is currently and how the landscape of clinical research may be changing as we move forward. And it's particularly nice to be having this discussion here at an organization that really is on the forefront of thinking about new technologies in the research space. And in fact, I came to realize your mission statement has innovative research in it, so it feels like a really good fit. One thing I'll note, what I would like to do today is to talk really broadly about technologies now, where they're going in the future. And I left time at the end to make sure that we could have a dialogue. I would really like to hear about some of the work that you're doing. Yesterday, the conversations, again, with the fellows were tremendous, and I think truly on the cutting edge of where we're going. So I'm going to start with a story, and I'm going to tell you a bit about my grandfather. So this is my grandfather. He, as I joke with my husband, when I told him, I said, I'm really close with my family. He had no idea what he was getting into. I'm really close with my family. That's probably why we dated for 9 years before we got married. But I say, there's no bait and switch. He knew what he was getting into. So what I'm showing you is a picture. It's my mom, my grandma, who just passed away this year at 102, and really amazing woman. There's my grandfather, and then there's my aunt. And the reason I wanted to start by talking about my grandfather is I wanted to think a little bit about his life as a person who had diabetes. And he was a very meticulous patient, the type of patient that we all really like to an extent, but he would, and I'll tell you why, but we would go with him usually to his appointments, and he would see his primary care doctor, who happened to be a family friend of ours, about twice a year. Now, my grandfather, I mentioned, is very meticulous, so he would be one of those people who had the little books, and he would write down his glucose. And when I was in college, what I used to do is I used to average all these glucose values because I thought I was doing a big service for him. The problem I came to realize when I became a physician, when you average glucose that's 47 and values that are in the 200 and 300 range, and you give a value somewhere that looks average, that actually is not very effective and not very helpful. And I think if we think about what we understood about diabetes as an example with a patient like this, with this kind of episodic amount of information, bucketing patients broadly into these disease categories. My hope is that technologies will help us move away from this so that we empower patients to take better care of themselves, but also as a research community, we start to understand diseases in a much richer way. So that is my goal today. So I'll talk about three different areas. One of them is refining health and disease using new technologies, and we'll dig into that a bit more in a minute. The second concept is around integrating data and using new machine learning techniques. And I talked with some of the groups yesterday, and they're starting to be applied. And I think we could have a rich discussion on where these tools are likely to be most advantageous. And then finally, thinking about knowledge exchange and the fact that the research community is changing. Participants are becoming much more engaged. And again, I think DCRI is at the forefront of really thinking about how to put participants and patients front and center. But it's something that we need to do universally. So let's start first with this concept of refining health and disease. So do we have any hematologists in the room? Any representatives? There's usually one or two. I love hematologists, mostly because cardiologists, I tend to think we're a little more blunt with, we want to treat things, and then you sit with a hematologist, and they want to talk about the coagulation cascade and the exact mechanisms. But what I'm showing you here is, this is a slide showing 4 different types of anemia. And I use this mostly to say that technology is not something that is today. I mean, if you think about it in some ways, even just having a blood smear is a new type of technique and technology. But by doing this, what people were able to do is to substratify anemia. And again, I won't go into the details, but these are 4 different cases of anemia. And what we know is that if we took all 4 of these patients and we gave them B12, we would not be able to treat the vast majority of patients with anemia. We needed this technique. We needed to look at the blood cells in this way to understand how to get the right medications to the right patient. And I think as we have new technologies that go beyond our standard technologies, we're going to start to understand diseases in a very different way. The idea that we're bucketing disease classes into ICD-10 codes is just not, I think we're going to start to move beyond that. But I want us to remember that this is not there's nothing novel or nothing new. We're just using the latest techniques. So what techniques and what tools do we have out there? And I think one thing that's always nice to start with is to think about something like the cell phone, which is how many people have a cell phone with them today? Does anyone not have a cell phone? Okay, no one, or at least someone's shy. Even my grandmother, who was 102, as I mentioned, she had her cell phone when she realized she could text her grandkids. Then boy, did she learn how to do that, and it's a great motivator. But so the point here, though, is that technologies are going to get smaller and smaller, and that's going to be one of the themes that we talk about. So on the left-hand side of the slide is the first cell phone. It was about 1 foot tall. I had the version that was kind of right to the right of that, and the funny thing is I used to keep it in a box. And it looks like maybe Eric, maybe John, maybe you guys had the first one, and it was huge, right?
It was a bag phone. Was that? Yeah.
Bag phone?
One.
Oh, excellent. We got some early adopters here. Not afraid. Oh, old and early. I didn't say it, but that's great because I had the next version, and what I would do is I would keep it in the box, and then I'd wrap it in a bag because I don't know, maybe I thought I was going to get stuck in a hurricane and something was going to rain on it, and then I would put it in the car and I'd leave it in the trunk, and that's where it would sit. And that's how I interfaced with my cell phone. And again, that's within our lifetimes. And now we have these technologies, again, that are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and they're ubiquitous. And so we have to start thinking about ways to tap into this device, which really is a supercomputer, but it's also a technology that's going to help teach us a bit more about what people are doing, how they're engaging with their life and their healthcare. Because, again, going back to my grandfather, if you think about his interactions with the healthcare system, I showed you that slide where he saw people twice a day, but there's this idea, patients are living, they're breathing, they're doing all sorts of things outside of the confines of our 4 walls. And what's interesting is the scale and utility of smartphones, kind of in addition to this shift in healthcare, again, this idea that people are going to start to interact with their data. We can talk about the right way and how we think that's responsible. But that really has catalyzed this biosensing wearable space. And obviously in the back of the room, I'm sure you can't see each one of these companies that's on the slide, but I think this is just to illustrate the fact that this area is getting inundated with different types of tools. And we as a healthcare and research community are going to ultimately need to decide what we think is most valuable. And so I do always remind us as a community to say we have a responsibility to start testing these tools to decide what should be clinically actionable. The other thing that I think is important to note is that I moved from Boston. I now live in Silicon Valley, and it's very easy when you live there to think that everyone's kind of doing certain things. And I think many of you know there's a big quantified self movement there. So it's not uncommon to go to dinner where people have their air quality monitors and they're checking things, and people have 5 or 6 different wearables. But we have to. I mean, even I recognize that is a very unique slice of the pie. But it's not only people in Silicon Valley who are going to be adopting these tools. It's a much broader group of people. So we were talking with the fellows last night, and we were thinking about why people and how people interact with getting medical data, and certainly medical education is shifting a bit. I'm sure some of you are involved in medical education, but this idea that potentially the next generation of healthcare providers are going to be thinking about ways to organize information, not always memorize the information. The top right hand shows ways of conducting research. This is a project looking at malaria tracking. And true epidemiologists, which I know we have epidemiologists in the room, this is a very similar principle, the same as when cholera was being tracked, but now we have new tools and techniques. Again, this is something that's being done internationally. Kids are interacting with data in a very different way. There's some interesting examples of looking at children with ADHD and trying to understand their particular patterns of disease, and how do you actually potentially modulate some of the pathways. And there's also the world of virtual reality that in the question session, if we want to talk about that, I'm happy to. And then this idea of understanding potentially your environment. And so there are groups that are very interested in patients with asthma, for example, and understanding different pattern tracking. So people may, I don't know if anyone's worked with Propeller Health, but what they do is they lay over the data around what's happening in the environment, what's happening with the ozone, and there may be areas that patients should avoid because they notice that they have triggers and they start to use their inhaler more. So again, this is not the type of thing, I think shifting a little bit away from this idea that this is just information for those of you who want to run your third or fourth marathon. And there was a funny conversation last night. Apparently, I think the fellows are taking on some faculty in terms of who's the healthiest. So I do know that there's some fitness enthusiasts here, but these are the types of tools that are going to be used more broadly. The other thing, so now we're kind of getting smaller and smaller, and again, the idea here is to talk about tools and techniques and where things are going to, or this is obviously my opinion, but where I think things are going to be most valuable. And so, we talked about the cell phone, we start to think about wearables in general, and I do think there's been a little bit of there was a hype around the idea that everyone was going to wear a Fitbit, for example, and then what we see is around 3 months and 6 months, there tends to be a decrement. And I also really enjoyed yesterday hearing about some of the early work that's being done by the teams here, really understanding the pain points with these wearables. Nonetheless, these are going to start to do things that people will find valuable. And as you add value to someone's life, I think that the adoption and adherence will go up. So there's signals that are going to be known signals, so things like atrial fibrillation. And in Grand Rounds this evening, we're going to be talking about atrial fibrillation and some of the new tools and techniques. And we have to think, again, we definitely need to test this because let's say you find 2 seconds of atrial fibrillation. Currently, all of these devices are commercial grade. There are a few companies that are working on medical grade devices. But when we have medical grade devices, we are going to be on the receiving end. For those of you who are internists and those of you who are cardiologists, we're going to be on the receiving end of what do we do with this information. And there are groups here that it's really great to see are on the forefront of saying, all right, let's study it. And let's decide, do they need to have anticoagulants or not? But again, we need to know this. Now, that's the sort of known signals. The other interesting thing, though, is these devices are going to start capturing things that are unknown. So things like galvanic skin response, temperature, sleep-wake patterns, REM cycles. And these are where I think that there's a lot of research to be done because the easier things to go after are known signals, and that's where a lot of companies will invest. But this idea that there are probably things that can help differentiate, for example, types of heart failure. We know that there are biomarkers that can do this, but clinically what we wait a lot of times is wait for someone's weight to go up. But there's some early work suggesting that maybe someone's galvanic skin response is changing early as they start to go towards an exacerbation. So again, this is another area. My goal here was to think about ways and tools that might be used in research. And I do think this concept around unknown signals is something that is going to be particularly rich and something that needs to be studied. So thus far, I've talked about cell phones. I've talked about this concept of the wearables. I think most people, when you talk to them around digital health, that's what the conversation typically centers around. But the next wave that we're going at, you may have, someone would raise their hand and say, but you said that people stop wearing these devices or after 3 to 6 months. The way that the world, I think, is moving is to try to actually instrument devices of everyday living. So for example, this could be instrumented, right? And I can see if my heart rate goes up, was I getting nervous? But their everyday life, buttons are going to be instrumented to see how quickly someone can take off their clothes or put it on. This is one tool, one of my colleagues named Anupam was working with a technique to try to stabilize someone's hand. And it was actually originally around sniper work. And then I think he realized that it'd be really nice to do something humanitarian. Not to say, I guess it takes all types, but you may not be able to see this, but what it is, there's a spoon, and he's actually showing you the original prototype, because a lot of these devices, it's been one of the most fun things I think about my current job is really being around people and engineers who are building the early prototypes, and then you see how they develop. He had built a spoon that's a tremor canceling spoon. And it's really amazing to see people who haven't been able to eat all of a sudden be able to eat. It's particularly, right now, it is tailored to work on Parkinsonian tremor, but they're working on different oscillations. Now, on one hand, it's great that it's a tool, it's helping people's quality of life, but what we can also start to do is understand someone's tremor, not twice a year when they see their physician, but this idea that as you start to tailor medications, you watch to see, it's something that people are doing every day, hopefully, they're eating, and you can start to see what's their tremor like during certain times of day, what's it like during certain seasons, what happens if I titrate a medication, and then I look to see not in that visit 6 months later, but I actually get the feedback now that the patient's tremor is getting better or worse. So this idea, again, kind of planting the seed that instruments of everyday life are going to start to be monitored. And for people, I think particularly, I don't know if we have any neurologists. I met nephrologists yesterday. I met a pulmonologist, cardiologist, infectious disease. But if there are neurologists in the room, as a cardiologist, I got really excited around the cardiac and activity monitors. But my general sense is devices around movement disorders are likely going to be really the first big breakthroughs, because it's pretty easy to have, and we'll talk about this evening, but this idea, the accelerometers and the gyroscopes are pretty good, and you don't need the specific sort of PPGs and raw waveforms. You need more algorithms to analyze that data. In this case, the feedback is pretty clean, and I think really understanding this will be important. But again, this is a place where research is going to need to be done, because the ultimate win here would be to say, if you understand someone more continuously, you can actually tailor their medications and make their quality of life better. So as we're getting smaller and smaller and smaller, I got to the concept of instrumenting tools of everyday life. But there's other things and this is this concept of a platform where this is a contact lens that has a chip. So it has an integrated circuit, it has 2 LED lights, and then it has a wireless connection around the outside. And the reason I'm showing this to you all is this idea that, again, everyday life, many people wear contact lenses, and this is starting off as a glucose sensing contact lens. And I started the conversation telling you a bit about my grandfather and averaging his glucose levels. And one thing that was really interesting was that I used to tell him, well, you have to eat properly because, well, he ended up, maybe not when he was in his older days, but when he was a little bit younger, I'd say, you're going to get kidney failure in 5 years, and you're going to get this. And it was so far removed from the moment that it's very hard to change people's behaviors. But if you have something like a contact lens that has an LED light in it, when you go to the donut shop, and I was in Boston for many years, I don't know if do you guys have good donuts down here? Is that Krispy Kreme, oh, right, yeah, hot, donuts are hot, yes, I should have remembered that. In Greenville, we actually had a great Krispy Kreme shop. In fact, I remember having to sell a lot of them too to make money for your high school classes and stuff. And then I think we ended up buying most of them. So this idea that, so in Boston we have Dunkin' Donuts, right? And you try to tell your diabetic patients, don't go into the donut shop, but it's really hard. Now, if you had a contact lens though, and I'm just putting this out as a concept, when you ate that donut, you have a red light flashing, it's a much more immediate feedback. And you know that your red light's flashing, and you know that your glucose is high, and that is actionable. And that is something that tech companies do very well. They know what makes you tick. And telling someone 10 to 20 years from now you might have nephropathy, it's really hard to get people to change behavior. So again, this idea, and we've joked, for some people you can opt in, do you want a red light? Do you want like a little taser? What stimulus do you need as an individual? Some people like positive, maybe you're in the green zone. But this idea that getting information to people quickly so that they can start change their behavior is important. And again, another tool, I think, to understand what's going on with individuals. And I'll talk a bit more about that at the very end in terms of the research, where I think the research really needs to go in this regard, because I think the more we understand around behavior and behavioral economics, it's going to enter into all of our fields. Even if I sort of fashion myself as a traditional cardiovascular researcher. But at the end of the day, if we can't change behavior and we can't get people to feel engaged, even just think about adherence, then we're not doing our job. So I think all of us are going to be thinking in this way. And then just to give you a sense of this is the integrated circuit, and this idea, and I think you could probably brainstorm in every single one of your fields and what you're doing now, ways that you might come up with new human signals. And I use human signals really broadly because it's an agnostic term. It's not a known signal, it's not an unknown signal, but this idea that we're going to be able to instrument all sorts of things. And again, I know we're in a research space right now, but the more you're engaging and thinking, gosh, I think this would be really helpful as I'm understanding my given disease state, I think the more advanced we'll be. And one thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I know when Eric came to visit, we talked about it, how do we as physicians technology is coming into the healthcare space, and how do we as providers and as researchers have a very active voice? And so I think now's the moment to start thinking about these different areas. And as we get even smaller, so we're getting really, really tiny, this idea of taking a deep dive into human systems biology, even at a molecular level, starts to come up. And I personally have been working in the biomarker and the genetic space for several years. And one thing I noticed is that we were running into informatic bottlenecks. We were trying to combine clinical trial data sets with genomics and proteomics and metabolomics. And while we were able to do it, at one point I was told that we could only run analyses, and maybe you guys probably are more advanced, but I could only run analyses from 3 to 7 a.m. because we were jamming up the system. And as much as I had a great collaborative relationship with the biostatisticians that I worked with, it was hard to get people, you can certainly delay it, but it was hard to get people engaged in the middle of the night. And despite the fact I did think I kept, Mike and I spent one Saturday night working really hard. By the way, incredibly hardworking guy who was super helpful. I think getting people to do this all the time at night is kind of a problem. So why do I think things are different now? And because you always hear, things are changing, things are different. I think the reason that things are different is that we're thinking about studies and we're thinking about analytic platforms that are going to start to help us align all of these different data types. And one thing that we've been spending a lot of time talking about, and I see so many familiar faces that we've worked with over the duration, but we're getting close, is working on the baseline study. And it's something that we're incredibly proud to be working with you all on. And it's this idea of really building a coalition of individuals who want to create a universal data platform. But in order to do this, we really do need the gold standard. And certainly we've looked to see, are there other data sources that have rich clinical molecular imaging, physiometric, and behavioral data? They are out there, but not to the depth that's being done with your leadership. Because there is this idea that if we can merge all of these different data types, not only will we understand these individuals who are going to be volunteers and participants with us, but we'll also understand what it means to look at other populations and how do they interact with this group. And the reason why I think things are different, and a lot of times people say, well, you know, we've been doing molecular analyses for many years, but the reason I think it's different is that if you think about how much data is in the study, it really is staggering. So for each individual, and we're running a pilot now, it's about 4 to 6 terabytes of data. And for those of you, some people who are informaticians know that this is a lot of data. For those of us who live in another sphere, and as I've started to work at Google, I realize if you talk in Star Trek speak, it really resonates with people. So 4 terabytes, and this is just one patient visit, 4 terabytes of data is 3 times the 12 films and all 726 episodes. And that's just one patient visit. Patients are going to be seen over a series of years, and it doesn't even account for continuous raw waveform data that comes from different devices. So a huge amount of data that's going to be coming out. And I think now's the time to tap into the resources that you have and the resources that are available more broadly to start to analyze this data, because we're doing it for a lot of other things. And we might as well be doing it in the healthcare space. And I will then get to that in the second concept here. So I think in the first part of the talk, my goal really was to think about new technologies that are out there, some of them that are going to be used currently. And again, I really enjoyed talking with the fellows yesterday about some of their early work, which is incredibly innovative. But planting the seed that these signals are going to be coming from many different places, and really hoping that we think broadly about how to use them. So in the second part, I wanted to talk about why tapping into some of the tech resources that are out there are likely a good thing, and it's important for us to do as healthcare researchers and providers. So what is this concept of integrating data and applying machine learning? So I mentioned that there's a lot of data coming in and out. Whether it's coming in through YouTube, whether it's coming in through Facebook, whether it's coming in through devices and your cell phones, but there are systems out there to ingest huge amounts of data. And the example I'm most familiar with is YouTube, because it's right across from where our office is. YouTube's right across the way. And it's actually a really funny place to have people come and visit, because each of the rooms is named after one of the most popular YouTube videos. But when you invite someone who's not from your group, and it's you say, oh, meet me at Charlie Bit My Finger, people are like, what? And then it took me a while to realize, oh, that's actually a really popular YouTube video. I don't know if anyone's seen that one. But anyway, so the building's right across the street, and I've gotten to know some of the people who work there to really understand their capacity to ingest data and to deal with it. And one thing that they say jokingly, but they've taught me, is cat videos are super popular. So I don't know if does anyone have a cat? Okay. Anyone take a video of their cat ever? People really like to take videos of their cats. And what we've come to realize is actually I'll circle back to, it's actually a good thing for health that people are doing that, because the ability to handle just 300 hours, which is a fraction of what comes in, that's about 6 whole genomes. And as you start to think about how much input you have and how much people download, the advantage is that we have to learn to deal with this. And so there are huge data centers that are out there to deal with this. And in general, in the tech world, the philosophy is that you need to have at least 1 plus 1, if not 1 plus 2. And because things like the internet can't go down, you have to have reserve compute, and you have to have reserve data centers. And what's nice is that you can tap into these for healthcare. And so I personally tell people, go and upload more cat videos, because then we can do more healthcare research. So you're actually doing a good thing for health by taking pictures of your cat. But in all seriousness, there is compute that's reserved, and it's not being used. And there are ways that I think that if we're not applying this to healthcare research, and if we're not tapping into these data centers, again, whether it's through Google, whether it's through Amazon, whether it's through some of these other cloud computing enterprises, then we're not really tapping into a resource that's there. And as we think about it, the computational power here to really think about scientific research that leverages large algorithms and platforms goes beyond just the compute. Because the way a lot of these platforms have been built, if you talk, we were joking last night, I had spent so much of my time working with physicians, now I spend a lot of my time working with engineers, and they think very carefully around scaling and how do you scale these platforms. And the person right now who's building out a lot of our healthcare platforms came from MAPS. And the way things are built is they try to scale from some of the same concepts of maps. I mean, it feels different, right? It's roads, it's systems, but it's still a lot of disparate data types. If you can leverage that across these systems, then we'll actually accelerate the way that research is done. And so again, it's nice to see this in a space that I think we in this room all care a great deal about. And in order to do this, and I'm happy to talk later, there are kind of ways of thinking about new platforms and using new data types and merging, and I can talk about that if people are interested in it. But this idea of really understanding the data and then using tools to explore it has become of a particular interest. And the reason why, and again, a minute ago I said, even though people say things are changing, I do think there's a moment here where the machine intelligence landscape is changing. For a while, much of the machine intelligence resided on the left-hand side of the slide, sort of traditional artificial intelligence. And the way typically that will work is you're ending up feeding a lot of information in, and you're able to analyze that information. But there have been some recent breakthroughs with deep neural networks, and this idea that you actually are having reinforcement learning is something, for example, there's a group in the UK called DeepMind, and they've been thinking about, people thought that it would be a little too challenging, that they got, I was talking to them last week, they thought that the road would be much longer than it is, but this idea of reinforcement learning is changing the way, for example, natural language processing is done, image recognition, so the same tools that can try to differentiate. I don't know if anyone has sort of newer photo tools where it will aggregate, both on this platform and other platforms, but it will pull all people who look similar, it will pull your kids. But that same thing, we have to think about what are the applications, for example, in images. And this morning we were spending some time talking about what are places where these tools would be most valuable. I think it's really, replacing clinical decision-making can be very hard, or not even replacing supporting, but there are places where support is going to be more evident. And the reason that I think things have changed is if you look at some of the recent kind of odd wins, but they're still wins in the machine learning landscape. And I don't know if does anyone know, so did anyone follow this, AlphaGo? Okay, so this is, I'd never heard of Go. Has anyone ever played Go? Oh, okay, we have 2 Go players. It's apparently amazingly hard. And they say that there are this many different possible combinations of moves, and I'm very impressed. I actually have only read about it, but it seems like a very interesting game. But this idea that there are many, many moves here, and that it's not something that you could very readily, or it wasn't thought that you could readily have neural networks that would understand this. But again, this group, DeepMind, started to think about, they ended up feeding different moves in different plays. And over time, what they started to see was that the machine went way beyond what they were teaching it. And it started to look for new patterns. And it's that transition that really, I think, is going to start to change the way that data analytics is done. But it goes back to what do we as a community want to apply these tools towards, because there are clinical problems where this is going to be a great solution, and then there are other things where it's not. But I think being on the ground, thinking about the best use of these tools, and I know there are many groups here that are already using these types of machine learning algorithms, and several of them, even some of the latest ones, are now publicly accessible. So TensorFlow was released as a public resource. But the fun thing is that we can now start to use them. So in the last section, I wanted to consider this idea, now that we've thought about ways of extracting human signals and ways of integrating data and where the landscape may be going. And again, the number of great examples, there's a handful of examples with machine learning in the healthcare space, but I think if we were to talk again in a year, things would be even more advanced. In terms of this final concept around knowledge exchange and the idea that we're no longer going to be dealing with a patient who's in a healthcare setting, but this idea that participants and patients are going to be actively engaged. And I know you all have thought about things like the President's Precision Medicine Initiative, your own initiatives with engaging with patients, but it's no longer the idea that you do clinical research and then something shows up 6 to 7 years later. And even as of a few years ago, that's how trials, or at least that's how I was involved in running trials. But this idea that people are going to want to ultimately be measured not only by hard cardiovascular outcomes, for example, as a cardiologist, but people are going to want to know how functional someone is. And what is someone's quality of life? And as we move more towards risk-based models, and I know we talked yesterday a little bit about this idea around the payer environment and ACOs, again, their hard cardiovascular endpoints, hard endpoints in general are going to be very important, but there's going to be this idea of how are you actually changing the journey. And currently, there are a number of patient and participant portals. Some people work with REDCap. We've been thinking about tools to try to engage patients, engage participants. This is going to be a two-way street. We've worked with the group here around different portal ideas. Then there's this idea around education, engagement, and tracking. And this, I think, is going to be particularly relevant, especially as physicians and researchers have less and less time to spend with an individual. And there's going to be huge pressure, and you guys are already on the front lines of this, of reducing costs in clinical trials and increasing retention. One way of doing that is really thinking back to how do you get people engaged? How do you keep them involved in this journey? And it's probably going to be different for different people. We've done a number of sort of focus groups now trying to understand people in different demographics, people of different ages, what's most compelling to people. And I'm happy to chat about that, but some of it's really eye-opening. You make assumptions about what you think is going to make someone tick, and that's just not the case. The other thing, which is a trend I think in the research community, is really pushing a lot of the clinical research into real-world evidence research. And as you do that, how do you actually collect this information? Again, I think an area where you guys are really out and kind of the front runners in this regard. But there are going to be ways to try to reduce, I think, the burden and engage patients more. So I wanted to end with the concept of the patient with diabetes. Thinking a bit about my grandfather and thinking about how I think the paradigms are going to change in terms of treating him, but also understanding his disease. And I don't have to tell you guys, many people have diabetes. This concept, I think I've now gotten to the concept of this episodic understanding of an individual, either as a provider or a researcher, is changing, and the numbers here are on the rise. I don't have to tell this group that patients are overwhelmed. So one thing we do have, I think this is a very ripe research area, is what is the right cadence and amount of information to give back to patients and to providers. I spend part of my day saying, because people think data is really good, and I spend part of my day saying, you know what, physicians are really, and healthcare providers generally, are really taxed. There's a lot of information coming at us. What is the most actionable information? And again, I think the research around that and understanding that and how it fits into the systems will be incredibly important. We know that issues with this care, my last slide, really does contribute to poor adherence. There's some really interesting research around adherence, and we'll talk more about that this evening. How do you actually, there's some methods that people think would work, but it actually doesn't work. It's been very interesting talking to large pharmaceutical companies, but also pharmacies themselves as they are trying to figure out how to get people to take medications. And I know there are people in the room who focus on that as well. But this idea of adherence is, I think, incredibly ripe, and it's hard. I'll just pause and tell a quick story. So for many years, I was a clinical trialist, and I used to go to a few meetings, and there's one investigator in particular who every time we would talk, we'd meet at the NIH, he'd say, but Jessica, you know, you're spending all this time looking for another therapy. Why don't you just get people to take their current therapy? And I'd be like, oh, he's such a nihilist, and doesn't he see, you know, and this idea, you know, why are we stifling innovation? But, you know, and I still am a huge fan of new therapies, and I hope I'm getting to the concept that I think the more we understand about individual diseases, I think the better we're going to be able to tailor therapies. But I will say, and despite, I had a moment the other day, I was like, gosh, I think he's right. I mean, that was not such a bad point. And it's not to say I think we have to push on both ends, but this idea of figuring out ways to get to get all of us, and I'm, trust me, I'm no different than anyone else. It's really thinking about what are the right levers, and I'd be interested to talk more with people. Are we going to be able to engage people? There's several products, right, that there are over 1 billion users a day for certain tech products that are out there. I don't know. Are we going to be able to make healthcare and make research as engaging, or is it just healthcare's different? And I would be curious to get your thoughts. But in any case, I do think there are ways to study this better. We know that it leads to poor management and the complications. I don't have to tell this group. If we can understand and push people towards earlier preventive stages, it ends up being great for the patient, and ends up being great for our system. But the issue, and this is where I think all of us in the room, particularly you guys, have a real opportunity, I think, to change the way we think about things, is that I think there's a decision gap, and I've definitely talked about this today, but there's also a data gap. And so we understand people in this punctuated way, but biology is actually much more diverse. It's complicated. I think the example around the spoon, the idea that people's tremors may be different, and I think particularly, for example, in places like diabetes, where we bin people into type 2 diabetes, for anyone who's either done research there or who's taken care of patients, it's very clear that people have different patterns, different excursions, different triggers. There's some really interesting groups looking at inflammatory parameters. But I think the more we start to move our research paradigm into the bottom right-hand corner and really understanding the actual and continuous biology, the better we're going to be at subsetting disease. And one thing we have been working on is a incredibly small continuous glucose monitor, and it'll be interesting to see. It likely will be about the size of less than a coin. And I don't know whether patients with type 2 diabetes are going to be interested or not in using it, but it certainly will give us a lot of information of the disease. And again, in general, I think this idea of treating patients with type 2 diabetes, kind of stacking and escalating therapies in a linear fashion and following current guidelines, my general sense is people are going to respond differently to different meds, but we in the room really need to start moving towards understanding this bottom right-hand corner. And again, I think you're in a unique position to do it. Because if we do this, I think we can start fresh, and we can provide this concept of better information, better understanding, and better treatments. And one area where I've been spending a lot of time is thinking about this space in diabetes, again, because it's a little easier than other spaces, because we think glucose is generally important. But as you all start to study unknown signals, and we work together, we can start to move into other spaces. But the paradigm, I think, is changing. I think it's changing first in the research space. We have to study things before we can actually change practice. And I really do look forward to working with you all on this. So I'm going to conclude and then save time for questions. There you go. All right, how does it work? Questions? All right. We got Mike.
Thank you for a great talk. Do we have any questions?
So I spend a lot of time building what I call principled predictive models. And I think by now journals like it, even Eric Peterson is a convert, and EHRs are starting to apply them. But then there is the mystery world to which you have a good eye and view, right, of Google and the other analytics. You mentioned Google Predictive API that tell us that we'll be able to gain insights that don't require the principled approaches and the causal factors. There is the mathematical magic of big data that will be able to learn things that we haven't learned so far. And from your insider's knowledge, how much of a hype versus reality is it?
Yeah, so I think there's some places where it's going to be particularly useful. I mentioned some of the images. I think we shouldn't be constrained by our preconceived notions, because we really don't. We don't have that capacity to do it. There are other places where I think it's going to be much harder, and I think you're alluding to this concept. They're analytic systems, these deep neural networks, where you actually don't know the nodes. They're essentially a bit of a black box. And my concern there is, even if, let's say there are amazing analytics, and I'll just throw it out to the group. So let's say you have algorithms that are much better, or even not even much better, they're better, but you come and see someone, you say, you know what, I can't tell you why, but you have a 65% chance of having a cardiovascular endpoint this year. I don't think researchers or physicians are ultimately going to accept that because I don't know how to modify that. What do I say? Good luck, get an insurance policy. I mean, I don't think that it's going to get traction in that way. I think on the other hand, again, with images, I don't need to know why it recognizes that face. I don't need to know why it differentiates it from a cat, but that's good enough for me. But here, again, this evening we'll talk a little bit about, people like the CHAD score. They like CHADS fast. They know what the points are. We like that, and it's actionable. And I think in the clinical arena, I am fairly convinced that the algorithms could be better, but I think clinical adoption is going to be really hard. So that's my 2 cents. But we debate this all the time because a lot of people say, but they're better. And I'm like, but they know it's going to use it. So, yeah. But good question. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
So I'm a gastroenterologist and health services researcher, and like you said, if we have these, great interventions, but nobody's actually using them in practice, then they don't work. So that's why I've always liked health services research. But we find, whether it's mechanisms trying to explain things, behavioral theory, sometimes it's because people don't have a ride or don't have access. So with this technology, it's not going to help people if it's too expensive or too complicated and they don't understand it and don't have access to it. So you'd like to think it all, gets cheaper over time, but what can we do for the access? Because so much of type 2 diabetes, for example, there was just an article in Annals that, after ACA, a larger number of people got diagnosed with diabetes, and presumably the same number of people without insurance also had diabetes, they just weren't diagnosed. So if you don't know and you don't have access to these resources, you're not going to get very far with any intervention. So how can we make this accessible?
Yeah, there's a huge, and it sounds like you're kind of in the center of this debate. I mean, there's a huge debate about our technology is actually democratizing health. It is actually a good thing because you're making some services that are not available to people more universally available, because most people do have, many people do have a smartphone, for example. And if you offer peer-to-peer coaching or coaching, and as I think the landscape changes as we start to go more at risk, and organizations, for better or worse, realize they're managing the whole patient, services are going to be provided at a fairly cheap rate. And so this idea that you actually are providing, patients, I was just talking with the CMO of Doc on Demand, and there's a big debate about do people want to see someone or can they work through a digital provider? But then he was providing statistics around many people who work, right? And they work shifts where they can't see a provider. And so my hope, but this is where we have to shape, is my hope that it actually provides resources to more individuals, and it provides resources to people who wouldn't normally have the luxury to get into a major medical center. Even the group, I was speaking with some of your fellows who were doing nephrology, and they were talking about how they're trying to be a care network for a much larger catchment. So I think if we shifted in that direction, I think there's an onus on us to actually shift it in that direction and make sure it's not these super high-end tools that are only used by certain individuals. The other philosophy that we've taken is the electronics that we're creating, they need to be small, they need to be disposable, and they need to be cheap. And so that is a little bit of a sea change, and traditional device companies don't always love that. Some of them have still chosen to partner with us because they realize swapping out the electronics for something cheaper, you're either kind of on the boat or you're not on the boat. And so it's been a really interesting discussion. But I do hope we continue to think about that in the equation.
Jessica, great talk. We had a research conference here a couple weeks ago where we looked at creatinine levels in our patients to try and refer people for nephrology care. And it took 18 months and $160,000 to identify our patients with a creatinine of 2. And so, how do you see this technology integrating with the ancient technology we just installed here and everywhere else around the country?
Yeah, recently being part of a health system that just installed said technology, it's tough. Yeah, I think that I talked to some of the people involved in the project, and they said, one of the big challenges was actually the labeling, right? So creatinine can be labeled in many different ways. My general thoughts are, you're right. I mean, there's a lot that's here, and we need to figure out how to work with the material that's here. As it turns out, there's the actual labeling of it, which is challenging, right? Some of our software engineers who are used to scaling things say, gosh, you've seen one clinical data set, you've seen one clinical data set, and they kind of want to see lots. And but I think that some of the issues end up being, so the first piece is there is a data harmonization, data standards, clinical data nomenclature. Groups are thinking about how do you harmonize that. I think that will get easier over time. The second piece is how do you actually extract data from systems that already exist? And a lot of it ends up being more, and I've talked with people in this room about it, some of it ends up being equally political as it is technical. And so there are middleware companies that can extract the information. It's just, how engaged are people in that process. But I do think my sense is if you guys did that project and it sort of took the next orthogonal piece, that it would be much cheaper. I mean, that's what I've seen. Groups like Kaiser, for example, who are closed health systems who are doing this a lot, they'll say the first project was really labor intensive, it gets easier and easier. And for them, actually, the harder thing is to figure out what actually to adopt in the workflow. Because all of a sudden, you're taking care of a patient, you can't have your creatinine parameter. We have to be really thoughtful around workflow. But I'm a huge proponent of, sure, I mean, in 5 to 10 years, it'd be really cool to have all of this information, but what do we do right now? So, thank you.
So, Jessica, thanks for coming, and that was terrific. And it's great to have you in this position with thinking through these incredibly complicated but important things. And a similar question to Kevin's around the same issue, that we have so much information right now that we're not using in ways that is so obvious, but there's so many barriers to be able to do it, and kind of what you're thinking about and what your role is in that. For example, the medication adherence, which is such an obvious area to try to figure out ways to improve. Eric Peterson sees somebody in clinic, he prescribes all these drugs, he's doing all the right things, he has no idea whether patients are even filling their prescriptions, and yet that information is readily available. But we can't get, and we're trying to, we can't, it's hard to both get the, I think you're right, it's personality, politics, money, it's hard to get the information organized in a way in a complicated healthcare system to be back to the right people in an actionable way to influence how care is provided. And there's all kinds of examples of this kind of thing. So it was good to hear your mentioning of behavioral economists and how we use technology not only to understand things, but to change behavior.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. Well, first, I'm glad that Eric's doing everything right.
We think.
He
says it.
Yeah, he seems to be doing it. So, I think you're right. I mean, it's such an odd thing that we write prescriptions, and then when you actually dig into the data and you see how many prescriptions people actually fill, and I'm sure there are people in the room who specialize in this, but the latest statistics I saw is that it's about 70% of people actually fill that prescription, and we think we're doing an amazing job. I have had some recent really interesting conversations with people who are actually on the front lines providing the medications. It's not very hard. The technology is to actually have, there are more advanced technologies where you label the pill, but then you have to go kind of through the approval process there. There are ways where we can know pretty easily, and obviously someone would have to opt in, whether they're opening their bottle or not, right? And that would save so much time because someone comes back and you're like, wow, your hemoglobin A1C is still high, and then you're trying to put them on some next generation medication, and then you're filling out the pre-approval form. It's not, that piece is not working. But I do think there are ways, my sense is that's one area that's going to, the question about what is now, that is data that is available now. And that's more about linking the systems. That's not, new age, sci-fi, moonshot material. I mean, that is something where we're going to get more information.
Do you have a question? Do you have a question?
Hey, great talk. I really like the idea of a contact lens that alerts you when you're walking into a donut shop.
Right, actually, I guess it could alert you ahead of time, right?
Well, the potential for that kind of technology is almost unlimited if you think about it. I mean, a lot of the problems that we're trying to solve with expensive and complex technologies are simple lifestyle-based choices. And so at the end of the day, you have this dilemma, which is sort of a societal problem that we refuse to face, but we complain about how much money it costs to take care of patients that collectively, GDP-wise, but yet our economy runs on making people into patients in a way. We have these huge industries whose primary product is the generation of people with illness through food and lifestyle choices and stuff. So how do you think about that in the context of, I mean, the wearables and all this stuff are pretty cool, but those tend to target very motivated people. These are like hyper athletes and, people who are already making pretty good choices. But then there's the other part of the iceberg that's under the water, who are making bad choices and have poor socioeconomic status and resources, and I just don't know how that part gets brought up through this kind of approach. I'm just curious if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So many nuggets in that. That was rich. First, I don't think the company's their tagline, increasing illness, so they probably haven't adopted that yet. But if you're looking for a marketing job, this is something I think about probably every day. And for those of you who know me, I did critical care cardiology, which is a place, way on the other spectrum of prevention. Really, really interesting care for patients. But I do think you're right. Shifting things further ahead of the curve is where we need to go. But you started to allude to this. I think incentives are going to shift a bit as you start to work with health centers that are becoming more outcomes-based, and they're taking on risk, and they're taking on risk of a patient over a period of time. The incentives, I think, will change. And this idea, as you say, we've generated certain sort of fee-for-service societies where we are incentivized, or at least that maybe a less cynical view would be we are not motivated to shift things on the prevention curve. I do think things are changing. With that in mind, we now then need to, it's our moment to capitalize on that and figure out how do we then incentivize people and think about behavior. And the issue is that I don't think it can be delayed. I don't think the standard advice, at least that I was giving in clinic, that in 20 years something may happen, it's not, I just don't think it's the way most people are wired. So the more immediate, so the two things I think about is, are there more immediate things? Like, I don't know if a red light is something that's going to motivate. We're still trying to figure out what that is, but it has to be immediate, or it has to be orthogonal. So what I mean by that is something totally different from their healthcare. So maybe as an individual, if I'm part of a program and I really like watching videos on my phone, if I do certain things for my health, I will get a free phone and I will have access to free videos. And so maybe I'm hoping that we can get people engaged in their health and getting myself engaged in my health. That would be a simpler route. But we're talking about ways, do we have to do something totally different? Because actually getting prevention to be real is going to take motivators that are traditional motivators that make people feel happy and good. So it's something I think about every day.
So Jessica, since they gave you such nice softballs, thank you very much for coming, and it was a phenomenal talk, not only by the content that you gave, but also the style. I mean, it was really wondrous. I think everybody who watched it both enjoyed, but also you saw sort of a master of how to deliver a talk, which is phenomenal. The good news is much of what you conveyed are things that we are thinking about here. The other part I was thinking about is that this is almost like the sense of like almost entering an age of enlightenment. If you think about where you and I trained at the Brigham and the degree to which there was a scientific, rigorous, standardized, set process, who sat where in grand rounds, how you delivered a speech, how you did science, was sort of all set in a certain standard. And now we enter this new era where that's all blown away. There's this destruction of that old way, and then we go to this new and remarkably fast-moving world. Phenomenal. But then, as we just have examples that you gave, there is Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos as an example, the opposite, where phenomenal potential technology, but enters a world and perhaps runs ahead of where the lights were and causes, in part, challenges. So in this world where there's both creative destruction of the old and we're creating a new, but meeting medicine where there's high consequences. What's the role between a world like Google that you live in, and what advice would you have? Let's imagine you were talking to the director of the Duke Clinical Research Institute. How do we partner?
Yeah, that's a super important question. Two things. One is I think the way that we keep, we want to keep all of this excitement and all of the enthusiasm and the innovation and the pace that you see and find in these organizations, but it has to be measured and tempered against the realities of biology. And what I say frequently is, and sometimes people aren't happy with this, I say technology is easy and biology is hard. And the humility around taking care of patients and studying patients, you realize there's some things, torcetrapib for us, it was going to work, right? But we needed to test it. And I think that partnering with groups like yours, if I was talking to someone who was directing said organization, I would say that the partnerships are critical. And if we don't do that, and we don't have independent validation, that is where the traditional scientific method is important. The places that we have to acknowledge, whether we're Google, whether we're DCRI, is that there are things that are moving. I even think if you go to sites like Patients Like Me, Count Me In, things are moving ahead, and we're either going to harness that or not. But there's a balance. But I don't personally think that these organizations can do it without traditional research. And I wouldn't even call what's going on here. You guys are breaking all sorts of boundaries, but with academic medical settings, I think they have to work together, which is something I'm looking forward to do.